So one of the big themes of 2014 in movies was the year of the Bible, is what Variety called it. Just all these biblical epics, and just it seemed like there were so many Christian movies, whether we're talking about Noah and Exodus, which were legitimate big budget biblical epics, or smaller kind of Christian-made films like God's Not Dead, or Heaven is for Real. Then there was the Roma Downey, Mark Burnett, Son of God movie, which kind of fits both of those categories a little bit. So this was a thing in 2014. There's a lot of press about it. What do we make of this? I mean, is this going to be a trend that continues? Why are we seeing this in Hollywood? Yeah.
I hope it's a trend that continues, because it certainly opens the door for a lot of discussion for people across the aisle. But it's also worth noting that there were quite a few duds as well. Movies that just didn't take.
That's right.
For instance, Exodus was a big budget bomb, but also smaller films like Left Behind, The Identical,
Saving Christmas.
Saving Christmas.
They kind of sank without a trace. And so I don't know. I think it's a measured kind of success that these films collectively have. But yeah, I've been trying to wrap my head around this one too, because it's definitely an interesting trend. I would say that the Hollywood films, the best way I could probably describe it would be to say that the Hollywood films, these revisionist Bible movies, are expressions of doubt and the difficulty of faith, whereas the smaller Christian films were expressions of certainty.
Yes.
And had a kind of a more confident veneer to them. They weren't as dark. And that kind of, I think, adequately summarizes the difference in approach between these two styles of filmmaking. I enjoyed, just because I'm, was raised on Hollywood films, I enjoy seeing what a big budget and a visionary director could do with a familiar story. And we could talk probably all day about Noah and the changes.
I don't want to get too much into that.
Yes.
We did a whole other video series about that.
But what you have in these Hollywood films are ancient stories told with very modern heroes, or anti-heroes, if you will, who are very dark and brooding, and who struggle with their faith, and who are angry at God a lot of the time. And you just don't get that same kind of feeling from the Christian films.
From the Christian-made films. Yeah, it's a really interesting, it's an interesting thing. I mean, even the titles of the Christian movies, like God is not dead, Heaven is for real. Like you can tell in the titles that they know what they believe. There's no questions. There's no mystery. Like, you know how the movie's going to end based on the title.
Absolutely.
Like, God is not, God's not dead. Heaven is for real. Like, so even that, I think, is indicative of how evangelical filmmaking is largely propositional. It's about like making a case and like, here's the argument for this. Whereas the best films, I feel like, aren't trying to make a case necessarily. I mean, they are. Every movie has a little bit of an agenda, I think, but they're more about exploring the nuance and the complexity. And I feel like that's what Noah did. I really liked the complexity of that film. We don't have to get into talking too much about that. But
there's so much we could talk about.
I know.
But when you talk about nuance and complexity, like you said that you think that the characters in the Christian-based ones were not necessarily dark and brooding. They're not dark and brooding, but I will say that they do start off with doubt. That's that's a device that we see. Like, you see the character struggling. The pastor in Heaven is for real.
That's true,
Heaven is real. The father, he is kind of doubting, but we kind of know where the arc is going. The arc is cleaner for him to get from doubt to faith. It's not as complex. It's not as nuanced. But I do want to give a little pushback.
That's a really important point to make.
And even in God's Not Dead. Not necessarily the college student, the one who's making the case for Christ. We have the Kevin Sorbo character, who's the brooding, a
very nuanced character.
Who by the end,
gets what's coming.
Becomes a believer as he's getting what's coming. But then also, the student, who's making the case for Christ, he kind of starts off a little, shaky, or needing to kind of maybe prove it to himself and prove it to others.
That's true. So there's an arc, a struggle, but maybe it's a little bit more
ultimately,
facile.
they are still kind of sermon illustrations. I feel like they are still preaching to the choir, which I think is the problem that we're kind of talking about, is that in addition to sort of the lack of nuance and complexity, is that these movies, for me, they, more than anything else, they kind of exist to flatter kind of Christians already believe about themselves.
Right.
I mean, I can't really see, any atheist or anyone who has any kind of genuine interest in Christianity being persuaded or convinced by a movie like God's Not Dead, which to me is a movie that is not only agenda-driven and basically a piece of propaganda, a well-meaning one, a well-intentioned one, and there's a lot about the movie that I did appreciate, but ultimately it just has this kind of casual condescension and superiority complex that I personally just found kind of distasteful.
Yeah, it's like a sermon. It's a film that's a sermon, basically. Like, I'm going to preach the sermon to you. And I heard recently someone say that we use different sides of our brains. Like, one side, obviously we know left brain, right brain, but for the beauty side, to take in beauty, to appreciate, to follow a narrative and a story, and then there's the logic side, where you're then trying to process an argument. And when you take a sermon and you put it in a film, you're like mixing and clashing the two, and it just doesn't work.
Film is a visual medium. It's primarily about beautiful, images and
Right.
It's not a PowerPoint presentation.
Right.
Exactly.
That's where the smaller films tend to fail. So they haven't used the medium to its fullest potential yet. They're still in a very verbal kind of propositional, like you said, mode. And but I do think that that is a genre, the preaching to the choir, sermon type of genre.
Absolutely.
And the social atmosphere out of which these films came is significant too. It's almost like a striking back, a kind of taking back something, or there's a kind of militant type of feel to a lot of the films. Like, we have to get out there and assert our beliefs more strongly. It's in reaction against kind of persecution that a lot of Christians might be feeling.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because it feels like a regression to the culture wars a little bit, just like the militant battle lines.
Maybe
drawn.
Not the most.
But it's interesting that those films are doing well at the box office.
Because there's a need for them.
There's an audience.
There's an audience. Yeah. Right.
And like what you were saying about, going back to the point of certainty, because I actually found movies like Noah to be theologically much more interesting, more rigorous than a movie like God's Not Dead, which, like you said, is about certainty. It is about preaching a message. But Noah, like in terms of what explores about the question of sin, about the fallenness of humanity, and the presence of love and grace and redemption, I just thought it was just a much more interesting and complex film. Not that it's a movie that ultimately maybe moves me. I feel like the movie, there are parts of it that didn't quite work, but as a work of art, it's fascinating.
But it engaged your mind and your heart in a more complex way than some of the others do.
Yes, I think films, I'll just go out on a limb here and say, I think a lot of great films are intended to divide and should divide to further conversation. If everyone comes out agreeing about a film, then the conversation just ends right there. There's nothing to chew on or fight against. Later, so I'm in favor of controversial films, especially. I have to hand it to. Hollywood produced 2 films based on the Bible, right? Which is a good year in terms of it's been a very long time since we've seen
directors,
films on that scale before. Yeah, not since.
I think next year we have a couple more, and Martin Scorsese is working on Silence, which is very Christian movie about Jesuit missionaries in Japan. So.
I wanted to say something on, you said 2 films based on the Bible. I didn't see Exodus, and I want to say I boycotted it because of the racial insensitivity in the casting. So I just want to put that out there.
That was a big issue.
It is a big issue.
One of many controversies with that film.
And I think that if filmmakers are going to continue to do biblical stories, that's something they're going to have to look at, because there's so much racial diversity in biblical times.
It seems like such a misstep for Hollywood-produced film to do that.
In this day and age.
In this day and age to do that in these times.
In such a racially charged time.
Exactly.
Cultural moment.
Not that, I love John Turturro. I didn't picture him as Pharaoh. There's not the first actor that comes to my mind.
No amount of eyeshadow can.
No amount of eyeshadow.
Because even a movie like Son of God, which is a much smaller film, like you still have this very European-looking Jesus who is kind of sexy. Which I just could not quite.
Wouldn't they say that's marketing? Like it's a necessity.
It is marketing.
That was Ridley Scott's rebuttal with the whole thing was this is the economics of the business.
But he was talking about it wasn't just the major actors. We were looking at I think a poster or a still, and all of those in prominent positions were European, and the only people of color, or I think they were African or African descent, they were servants, and I think there was a thief you know, that kind of thing. It's like there's, like you said, we're in a racially charged time. I mean, there could have been more diversity in the casting.
And in addition, I don't think the Exodus film, the PR campaign did not seek to engage the Christian demographic as well as Noah did, which is probably one of the reasons Noah did so much better. It at least, you know, set up screenings and got a dialogue going. Exodus came and went so quickly. I thought, what happened? This film cost so much money to make, and they just sort of threw it away.
To Eugene's point about the themes of redemption and grace that you find in Noah, I didn't like, again, I didn't see Exodus, but I never heard that conversation about Exodus, like what people were taking away or what it was causing people to talk about. So I don't know that the storytelling that they were really trying to wrestle with any deeper theological themes.
I do think Noah did a better job of just getting the conversation going.
I mean, did you guys, was there anything in terms of from Exodus that?
I mean, I liked it. I think I liked it more for the spectacle and kind of the artistry of it. And I thought some of the choices were interesting. I actually thought the portrayal of God was, you know, or God's voice as the little British boy was actually
I thought
interesting.
that was a bit of a misstep. It's,
I totally can see that.
Right, you've heard counter arguments to that.
I'm always interested to see how filmmakers make those choices, though, because how do you portray God?
Exactly, Well, the burning bush was good enough for for a while, and then you know we get a petulant 9-year-old boy being
petulant is
who talks back and is kind of sassy.
And that's kind of what made Noah interesting is the absence of God's voice.
Yes,
I mean, the movie is so much about
of hearing.
Exactly.
But at least with Exodus, he's personified. He's in front of you. He's easier to dismiss that way. But yeah, again, you have a hero who is more or less an agnostic, who isn't sure if he believes or he even hears God's voice adequately, and struggles the whole time between his own, between believing in God and believing himself, his own instincts. So the two are very similar in that way.
It's a very, I mean, even comparing it to the portrayal of Martin Luther King and Selma, just that idea of, and I think it's a very modern way of telling hero stories, is you make the hero more complex than
doubt.
They're an icon, but they had doubts and they wrestled and they weren't perfect. And that's just, you don't see too many biopics these days that are like they were made 40, 30 years ago where, these things doubts wouldn't have been so prominent.
Exactly. And then you have movies like God's Not Dead, where the hero doesn't hear God, but is very certain of his existence, and then goes out.
Which I think it's interesting that the success of God's Not Dead has sort of, I don't want to call it a sequel, but has sort of inspired a follow-up film called Do You Believe?
Oh, really?
Which is coming out, I think, in a couple of months by the same group,
team.
Same crew. So we'll see if lightning strikes twice, or if there's an increase in quality perhaps of the filmmaking. I'm not having any expectations there, but I'm very curious to see how this one will do.
At least the title is a question rather than
exactly. That's a step in the right direction. But you already know the answer to the question.
Sure.
So
tagline, yes.
So before we move on from this whole Bible year discussion, were there any films that were off the radar of most of the press in terms of this conversation? I feel like I hear a lot from people there's never good portrayals of Christians in movies, and it's always extremes, like Noah is a crazy person or whatever. But I feel like there are films out there, smaller films that don't get seen, that do have more nuanced, interesting portrayals of people of faith and just journeys of faith. So were there films last year that we haven't talked about yet that you maybe could highlight? One for me is a little documentary called The Overnighters, which I highly recommend to people. I think it'll be on Netflix in February. It's about a Christian pastor who opens his church to kind of homeless people, and there's this whole almost dormitory of homeless people who live there, and he gets flack from the community, they think it's, they're trying to shut him down, and he's fighting to keep it open. So it's this really interesting portrayal of a Christian trying to be charitable and wrestling with different things.
I remember when that came out. I really wanted to see it. I haven't had a chance to yet. One of the films that stands out to me is a movie called Calvary, which I think some of us are familiar with, and that contains a portrayal by Brendan Gleeson, who plays a Catholic priest, an Irish priest who ministers to this small town, and it takes the shape of a thriller. It's his life is threatened in the first scene, and he's trying to figure out what he's going to do about it. And it's a very sympathetic portrayal non-ironic portrayal of the clergy, and a movie which attempts to engage a lot of guilt over the church's sins over the years. And it's a movie that definitely comes out on the side of forgiveness, but it's a tough film to take in many respects.
It is,
Very difficult film, but his performance is it humanizes a character who, for some of us, might seem a little bit abstract. But he dominates the film. His performance is tremendous.
Right,
I would definitely commend that to people who are looking for an honest portrayal of a Christian in a film.
Yeah, no, I thought it's a funny but tragic movie.
It does have a sense of humor too.
It does.
It's mixed in with the tragedy.
It's a dark,
the people
dark,
he
dark.
ministers to are just interesting characters.
Yeah.
I had a friend who said they think it's the best Christian film of 2000.
Yeah, no,
it's an intriguing choice.
I would put it up there on that list for sure.
Yeah, I feel like I need to see it again because I think I went in with a lot of expectation, especially after reading John Michael McDonald's interview where he kind of cites people like Bergman, Buñuel, and then Bresson, specifically Diary of a Country Priest.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Balthasar. So when I saw the movie, I mean, it is interesting that it's so self-consciously kind of an absurdist parable, an absurdist comedy, and there's a lot of dark kind of Irish gallows humor in the film, which I appreciate. But I think just on the point of sort of the theme of forgiveness and grace and the journey of this particular priest, I just thought it was a little too calculated for me, and that the whole movie is very determined, and then by the end of it, there just was not a whole lot of mystery for me. I was nonetheless impressed by it.
Yes, it's not a perfect film. It's a little bit wavers in tone a little bit. The transitions between comedy and intense drama aren't always graceful. But I think it has a very ambiguous final scene, a sort of montage in which we're reintroduced to the characters we've seen, waking up in the morning. And it's a very intriguing sequence that I think leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And I think that sort of protects it against critics who think they have the film figured out. It all depends on how you look at that final scene. But yeah, I can see what you mean. It's a little bit contrived in its situation and maybe not as confident in its tone. But nevertheless, there are just things in it that keep gnawing at you and keep you coming back to it.
The woman who is being beat says, if you look at anything long enough, it becomes beautiful. I think she says something like that. And the priest says back to her, he says, no, in most cases. You know, the whole idea of, like a lot of us talked about in this postmodern time, like everyone in that film is just so dysfunctional, dark. And I mean, and it starts off in a dark silhouette of the priest hearing the confession. And so you know this is going to be a film that's going to really take you there. But everyone's so broken. His daughter has attempted suicide. She did it the wrong way, and they make and that's where like the humor is kind of like they make the running joke again about how she slit her wrist the wrong way. But then there's a woman who's being beat, and then there's a man that wants the gun, and the initial confession, the guy who has been molested and wants to and is seeking revenge. But then I wonder. I was asking myself. I was like, so am I supposed to be finding some beauty in this because it's truth-telling, because it's showing me the state of where we are, and that we're still seeking for beauty, we're still seeking for God or some kind of transcendent experience in life? So it did cause me to leave with questions.
That's a really provocative question. I think we could ask that of a lot of movies that kind of really hone in on the brokenness of humanity, and does that kind of set the stage for us to really like see the transcendent and see God in a powerful way when we're just really real and blunt about the mess of our lives? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think European cinema, as I mentioned earlier, these days, that because Europe is so post-Christian and it's just that people have just such emotional responses to the church, and just it's hard to get at religion in a direct way. The Calvary was a movie that was more direct than a lot of films are in Europe these days, but I do feel like a lot empty European cinema is wrestling with this kind of post-Christian,
Christ-haunted Europe.
Christ-haunted Europe, exactly.
Beautiful churches that are empty, and there's actually a running joke in Calvary. There's the one Protestant church that has no congregants. So yeah, it's.
And on the Christ-haunted Europe idea, another film that came out this year was a Polish film called Haida, that is actually, I think, nominated for Best Foreign Film.
Best Cinematography.
And Best Cinematography, yeah.
Beautifully shot.
It's beautifully shot, yeah. But it's a film about a nun in 1960s Poland and kind of a lot of World War II kind of background in terms of looking into her family's role or story during the Holocaust, and
a lot of national guilt. To the extent that I understood all the themes that were kind of tucked away into that film, and it's very coy. It plays it very close to the vest because it's a very elliptical and mysterious film, but there's definitely a sense of reckoning with its own guilty past as a nation in which the Nazis weren't the only ones committing these terrible atrocities during the war.
Yeah, and then you have Haida on her own journey of faith that
she's
she's about
which is a whole different thread.
It's a good film also on Netflix, so recommend that.
Is there anything else we're missing?
Yeah, any other films that like directly dealt with kind of Christian themes or characters?
This might be cheating a little bit because the film itself is not about Christian, but it is by a venerable Christian filmmaker, and that's Wim Wenders' new documentary, The Salt of the Earth, which hasn't been theatrically released yet, even though it's been nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary, excuse me. But I was fortunate enough to see it on the festival circuit. Saw it twice, once in South Korea and once when it played at AFI.
Yeah, what's that about?
So it is about the great Brazilian photographer, Sebastião Salgado, who is basically regarded as the greatest living photojournalist, someone who's traveled throughout the world, shooting war zones, shooting nature, someone who really just kind of takes these beautiful yet unflinching photographs that attempt to show sort of the variety and suffering of humanity. And his own faith background is not made entirely clear in the film, but Wim Wenders, who is a Christian and who deals with him and the subject matter of the film in such a compassionate way. I just feel like it's a movie that just radiates humanity and spirituality.
Wenders has such a respect for artists, and he's made several very
films
good
about art and Pina
and his Ozu documentary, and he's quite he's quite respectful and in awe of his subject. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that one. I wasn't familiar with that.
Definitely, Wim Wenders is a name we should celebrate as Christians. He's such a great example of like a person of belief, Christian belief, making beautiful art in cinematic form.
Right.
So not so much the content itself, but it's a movie that embodies, I think, his spirituality.
And his gaze as a Christian comes through, just the way he looks at the world and at people. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that it's going to be released.
It's going to be released in the spring by a Sony Pictures Classic. So I would recommend everyone to go see it when it comes out.
Look forward to that.